directly connecting, and also we looked at sort of physical aspects as well of empathy, which is really fascinating, and then throw it open. So give you some data, and then we can wander around.
Sounds great. And that way, you know, it just contextualizes to the people, situations, and some practical takeaways for them as well. So
Yes.
lastly, Dr. Kerr is a founder of the Neurotechnology Institute in Adelaide, Australia. So please do go check out her body of work over there, and either for consulting or speaking engagements. I know that she's spoken at multiple different conferences around the world about building humans, how brains develop, human connection, empathy, learning, technological interactions, whether it's for kids or it's for adults. And I think, you know, she is very versatile in the sense that not only does she have the ability to contextualize this for individuals, parent units, family units, but she has a great understanding into how organizations operate, and she's done a thesis and a lot of work around it. So, you know, she has this multi-dimensional view of humanity, so to say. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Fiona, and let's just go into what she's got to talk about, and keep the Q&A for once she's done.
Okay. So now, last time, did you give me the screen so that I could screen share?
Okay, one second.
No.
You should be able to do that now.
Yes. So let me see. Oh, right. So if I drag, what's it doing? This over. Does that work now? Oh. Oh, for goodness sakes. Which one is it to? Okay, should be that one. Yes, great. Perfect. Okay, so I've got the same picture so that we know it's the same series. And so what I want to do, I think
it's showing
probably, sorry?
Oh, one sec.
What was that?
I think I'm just seeing my screen over here. I'm not being able to see your screen.
Can anyone else see my screen?
Can.
Yes, we all can. Yeah.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, good. Just go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay. All right. Well, because some people couldn't get on last week, I've just used 2 or 3 of the slides really quickly from last week to remind us. So empathy, what we were talking about last week, I guess, was how we grow brains, how we connect as social beings, and what that means towards the end of the talk last week in terms of technology. So when Panik and I decided to look at this week's and pull things out, one of the things that constantly comes up is social empathy, is empathy in general. You know, are there less levels of empathy with technologization? And that's at all kinds of levels, human adults, societies, legal aspects. But what we'll do today is really specifically looking at children. So if we remember last week, what we looked at, oh, sorry, this is all come at once, so we can just have a look at it. Okay. Can you see that now, Paneet? Is that better?
I can see that.
Yeah, okay. So we talked about the fact that whenever you interact directly, right from tiny, right from when the child's first born, but certainly the age that we're talking about, we get specific neurons, and we talked about those neurons firing and creating things like oxytocin, dopamine, certain opiates, that kind of thing. So you've basically got mirror neurons, and they become really important. The reason I've gone back into them is they are very much around the kind of empathizing and almost that mind-reading, mirroring activity. We've got many different types of mirror neuron, and some of those subsets are specifically to do with, there's one that's just for smiles and laughter, and that actually comes on faster than the one for fight and flight. So that really does show that we're positive. But also we have subsets for affect and for intent. So really quickly, again, in under a second, we're trying to figure out, without conscious cognitive effort, our brain is going towards judging what intent the other person has. And that's really critical when we come to emphasizing. And spindle neurons are extremely important as well in empathy, because this looks at trust. So they're called the trust neuron very often. Von Economo neurons is the technical term. And because they are to do with task as well as emotion, they tie up very much activity with feelings. And so they are even faster than the mirror neuron. They're about 12th of a second, as we talked about last week. So you can see that in under a second, what our brain's starting to try and do is figure out where the other person's at emotionally and where we're at, whether we're going to be able to make a connection. And then that lovely thing around the dynamic resonance of being in the simple space with other people. So physical space, sharing physical space, because we are pack animals, is critical. And I think I talked last week about, now we know that there's almost some of the volatilome statistics around the things that we give off are up to like 1,840 chemicals in a shared space. It's massive. So we are just built to give information across really quickly. We also talked about face-to-face activation. We talked about the fact that what you get when you interact is neural synchronization. And the synchronization is strongly in the socio-emotional aspect and in the feelings, amygdala, empathic aspects as well of the brain. So I'll go particularly into that today. So what you get is you get neural coupling. We can measure it if we put caps on people when they're interacting, and things like retinal eye lock, where we're looking directly at each other, create all sorts of activation of the lovely chemicals, the dopamine, the oxytocin, but also they increase things like immune system activity and a number of other things. So our brain physically, neurophysically starts to change. So as we summarized last week, we talked for a long time, and the summary is that the trust and empathy created by interaction, direct interaction of humans, mediates all sorts of chemical generation, what we secrete, how our brains use those. If we talk for a second about dopamine, because that comes up all the time in the aspect of, you know, getting online and social media, we get lots of dopamine spikes from the likes and those sorts of things. It's quite interesting that the way that the body uses dopamine when we get a like off the phone is different to the way the body uses dopamine when we get a smile. So those things become really interesting. And then, as we talked about, there's how well you are. It even goes to things like immune system firing. And there's some changes as well between boys and girls. And that becomes more important in the teenage years. So if we do have a program particularly on teenagers, then that becomes really relevant and really fascinating. So the neurobiology of empathy. So I didn't put that picture in to make you think, oh my goodness, we're going to spend 15 minutes on different parts of the brain. All I wanted to do was to show you that empathy is not just in an area like the amygdala or the hypothalamus, hippocampal area. It is very distributed in the human brain, and it's one of the things that makes us different. So empathy is critical to social communication because of all of those things we've talked about, the way that we pick up data and information. And one of the major reasons why we have had empathy, I guess, built into our brain and other mammals and things with children that have gestation periods is that it's really critical for parental care to be there for the long period that you need for human beings. We're very long to cook. So you need empathy as part of that connection so that you get that nurturing. Also, you have to be able to pick up distress and pain, because when a baby's tiny but can't tell you what's wrong, we have to get really good quite quickly at picking up sorts of things that are wrong. And the kind of chemicals to do with empathy increase love. And so we put up with the messiness and difficulty of years of looking after babies, small children, and eventually teenagers, and probably you could argue each other. And we get all these lovely things around opioids, around oxytocin, around prolactin, that kind of thing. A second really big important long-term thing, the reason that we're tuned that way is because it enables social group living. So again, because the child takes so long to mature to a high level where it's independent, we neurosociologically are equipped with, if I die, I need to make sure that the group is sufficiently fond of my child that it's going to take care of my child anyway. So it's it's another major reason why the social cohesion that created by empathy is really critical. And you can see that it's again a very long lens kind of thing. Another thing that's really interesting with humans is that we have the capacity for different kinds of moral reasoning and altruism than certainly other mammals, and we assume other primates, although we're always looking at other information there. But we do know that empathy is key. When we look at the parts of the brain that are involved in empathic engagement, then we know that as you learn how to be empathic with people, the areas to do with being altruistic and being able to reason around ethics and morals instead of just short-termism and what you want, they strengthen. So they bulk up and you see more activity across the areas. So one of the other differences is you see empathic response in other animals often when you see distress and pain. And even, our dogs, our cats, those sorts of things, we know that they know we're upset. They'll come and they'll put their paw on you. They absolutely pick up that information. And in fact, they pick up that data because of the chemicals that we give off really strongly, often before other humans do. But humans also don't need distress and pain to set off empathy. And so that's one of the other things that's different in us. So fascinatingly, what we get then is because we have more of the other levels of other areas of our brains that have developed, because we have more of the executive function, more capacity to use language to assist us to mentalize and to empathize, we're actually better at wider boundaries. So if you can start to create a capability through more of that kind of reasoning and more of that thinking about other people and other species that aren't exactly like us, then we're able to empathize. Whereas there are various types of, I guess, different species that can only really empathize with their own species. They can't do it outside their own species. So that is another thing that technically, certainly, is different in humans. And the better we get at being able to do that, the more we can be other-centered. Imagination and perspective taking and rationalization is really critical there. And that's one of the reasons why stories are so very powerful when it comes to empathy. They're really critical in being able to paint that picture and sit us in what it feels like. Okay, mind reading. So we talked about mind reading, and oxytocin is one of the major things that is critical for mind reading. And oxytocin is one of the main things that we get from direct interaction, from touch, from eye gaze, from sharing space. So one of the things that's interesting about what we would call mind reading is that we've got receptors, again, in various parts of our brains that pick up information about other people. And so they look at social behavior, and they also look at all sorts of things around affiliation. And when you look at reproductive and parenting behaviors, then lots of the kinds of things we've just talked about, the chemicals that you need to be able to connect and understand and read a child, for example, is very much in that. And so you've got attachment and affiliation. These dot points are not working, sorry. You've got social memory, as in what's the rest of the group needing, what does the rest of my social group need, and we actually learn how to react to social stress. So different communities, different societies, even different families will react differently to social stress. And it's one of the things that is quite culturally unique to different cultures. But we, at the same time, we still have cognitive reactions that are very similar in some ways, empathically. So what we learn to do is as we get better at interacting, and we'll talk about how you do that, and mind reading, as we get better at picking up that information, we reduce our social stress because we get more comfortable with being able to read a situation and being more relaxed in it. And we also increase the trust of social interaction because we have a wider capability to pick up nuanced information. And we get to the stage where we get much better at knowing that we have this kind of toolbox, a suite of social approach behaviour. The interesting thing is young children are pretty good at it anyway. They will tend to just go straight in if that's what they're comfortable with, and if they've been in an environment where openness to lots of direct interaction is normal, then they will tend to be a lot less wary in social situations. And you can see that in I'm really sorry about these dot points. The rest of them are hopefully fine. So when we have a social species that interacts a lot, like human beings, one of the things we notice is that, again, in the brain, there's an awful lot of oxytocin receptors in the brain in areas that are reward areas. So our brain actually rewards us with high levels of oxytocin in those areas when we interact empathically. So the more we smile, the more we connect, the more we understand the other person, the more mirror neurons get turned on, those sorts of things, the more oxytocin we get. So yes, and that's things like the nucleus accumbens and the prelimbic cortex. I think I was going to take that back out, but anyway, it's in there. And so another thing that happens when we interact a lot, when you hug your child, when you talk to your child a lot, when you explain what other people are feeling, which we'll get onto, then you also get higher levels of what's called somatosensory stimulation. So what that means is the children get multi-sensory stimulation, you know, of the touch, of the look, of thinking through what they're hearing and seeing. So through hugging and touch, and even things like the warmth of you hugging a child, increasing temperature, also they all allow those different parts of the brain to connect when it comes to empathic engagement. And they create the capability for this jigsaw, this lovely network to grow, because we're very plastic. So it makes for more nuanced empathy in the brain as the child's growing. And another thing that's really interesting is I guess there are all sorts of aspects when you're good at that. Because you get a highly interconnected brain activity when you're feeling empathic and positive, there's interesting studies now that relate that to that then prevents things like detrimental cardiac responses. So even when someone's, you know, worried or fearful, if they're in an environment, the more empathic you are, the less that happens. And if you're in social isolation, so if you have children that can't empathize and that they're not connecting, then that actually has quite a direct relationship with all sorts of things like heart rate level, blood pressure level, even in children 6 to 8 years old. So you're already starting to tie in those, I guess, those cardiac responses and those stress responses with the capability for the brain to connect empathically with another person. So some of the statistics then, what we're noticing is in the last 2 decades, that's just a general graph of the kind of social interaction versus electronic media use. So a good thing to think about is that what you've got is now you've got a tripling of things like the electronic media use. In the UK, there's now the lowest proportion of children in Europe who eat with their parents. We talked last week about how critical it is to have things like the meal table, because when you're interacting and eating, you also have microbiome chemicals that change the way that you're thinking and interacting and socializing, and it's also empathizing. And that's, I think, if anything, that's even lower in the US, but this is Europe. Oh, yes, it is. And so quite a lot of activity around socialization has now differentiated between, is it electronic socialization or is it face-to-face activation in socialization? And we spend, there's a lot of activity that's labeled, there's a lot of writing that talks about the time that we spend socializing electronically separates us very much from the physical networks. And so there's a Journal of Royal Society of Medicine piece that I can send you if you want me to read. And it's around almost the direct relationship between the social electronic and the physical networks that we get, and how big and small they are because they change shape. And some of the biological changes that we get when we have higher levels of electronic interaction is if you get the sleep efficiency details up, then they look at things like the autonomic and the metabolic and the hormonal effects of loneliness and social isolation changes sleep patterns. And it also, okay, so it also looks at the social contact and the cognitive functioning in all ages. And I think that we talked last month about how often you need to be interacting. So when you drill through the papers and the data, the common amount of information that comes back is, even if you spend 10 minutes directly face-to-face with another human being, and we can test cognitive performance, there's a direct change in the amount of memory and the amount of mental performance. So 10 minutes is as little as it takes, because the boost that you get of the kinds of chemicals we talked about last month speeds up the brain, allows for more attention, faster regurgitation, and more nimble connectivity in the brain, because of lots of different chemicals that get activated when we have direct interaction. And then there's something called the internet paradox, and it was originally done more than 20 years ago, and they're sort of updating it, they're doing it again. And they looked at the communication between family members, not only in the house, but also they looked at the size of their social circle. And then they expanded that out to look at levels of depression and loneliness. And what they found was there was a direct paradox between the two. So the more you had your internet group, the more your other groups, and it was quite linear. And the other sorts of things that have come out right from '98 on, and they're ongoing studies, are around the other things particularly linked to wider internet communication groups and shrinking direct interaction, are for children worsening of mood, limitation of and with the limitation of face-to-face, they get a poor quality of what they call liking, and being liked. So you have a difference when you are when what you need is the like on the message. What you're actually looking for is not only the dopamine spike, but it's also the need to be seen as successful by the peer group, instead of having someone who actually knows you and will spend that time with you. And there's various studies on diminished physical and psychological health, which I'm sure that you've had a look at. We can go into that more specifically next month if you want to, because it would take up the whole time. There are definitely differences in both because of the social isolation, and we will touch on some of that a bit later. So what you tend to get then is we can look at key stages of the psychological and the emotional and the social development over that 3 to 8 year period, and with different less social connections and with less direct interaction, you get different changes with children. So last month we talked about, for example, the 8-year-old girl who is trying to tell their parent a story about what they feel or what they've done, and if that parent is on the phone and keeps kind of saying, hang on just a minute, then that lack of direct attention, which is another critical part of mind reading, it's actually paying attention and being there, being present, they'll veer off and not actually talk about what's important to them. And you can look at this in stages of almost year by year. When you get direct activity of people not feeling that they are listened to, there's changes in that self-worth, the self-motivation, various aspects of how they grow. Some of the other stats just quickly that you can, afterwards you can keep. There's very robust now studies on screen time. So what there are functional changes in is the emotional processes and executive attention, willpower. That becomes important when we look at empathy, because you've got to really have the willpower not to just be sort of stuck on the screen because it's easy, as we know. The rapid switching and multitasking, so it actually weakens very specific areas in the brain. Emotional processing, so we're thinking about that now. A shorter attention span, and one of the things that I mentioned last month was a study from the UCLA where they took children completely away from screens at the age that we're talking about for 5 days. And one of the fascinating things was that the biggest improvement they got was the ability of children to read emotional states in others. So that even empathic capacity suddenly leapt. And that was one of the most interesting things. One of the other things is that young brains are very susceptible to this kind of, excitation and rewiring, or the lack of wiring up those really complex cognitive mappings for high levels of empathy. And yes, so the average now for children at the age that we're talking about is 9 hours a day in the USA for screens, 7 hours for the UK. So in 2018, the WHO has now listed gaming addiction, and they're going on now to look at screen addiction in general as a mental health condition. And they haven't said it's always detrimental, but they have said that it's a condition you have to now look at in terms of how are the screens being used, how often are the screens being used, and what else is being done. So what do we do? What do we do that's really positive and wonderful? As Puneet said, the big thing is modelling and mirroring. So we have this beautiful advantage. We're with our children and we can give them quality time. And one of the things to think about is that even before a child is verbal, they're still picking up information. So they can relate to an emotion, and they can absorb what that emotion is, and they can start to recognize feelings even before they get the words to describe what that feeling might be. So they're starting to pick it up. They can't rationalize it necessarily, but they can certainly absorb, joy, love, and sort of, fear, those kind of things as well. As soon as they are verbal, what's really good is to start talking to them about communicating their feelings. And that's right from tiny, it can be with a dog about he's happy, he's sad, or that's nice for them, or that hurts them, or, other children that they're playing with as well, ourselves. So the more we bring feelings into that discussion, positive and negative, then the more they start to learn that they're connected. So you describe what you see in others. You also, Siegel calls it name it to tame it. So in the age group that we're talking about, if you can get them to identify what the feeling is by listening to them and just asking some questions, then that also slows them down. And if they can identify it, then they can manage it a bit better, because at least once they know what they're grappling with, it doesn't mean that they're going to suddenly be able to fix it, but it's a really good tool to give them. It's almost like that, take a breath or count to 10, and then try and think about what it actually is. And children are remarkably good at that from young, if you start to build that in as a skill. And if you do it too, And again, you don't drown them with all of the things that, I don't want to go into work today because of the politics, but you just talk about the things they can actually see that you're doing. You might be faster, you might be a bit agitated, and you can talk through that's because you're going to go into work and you might not want to, it might not be as good today. It also lets them know that it's not them that you're rushing around not paying attention to for their fault, so talking through and being and thinking about how they are reading you is really important. Another thing that we always need to think about, which you talked about, Praneet, is that they watch us, and so they'll always watch and see what we're doing. And often they're very good at looking at what we're doing and what we're saying. And what children aren't good at is conflating the two and finding an excuse. So what do I mean by that? There's some really interesting studies of taking small children and even children in the kind of the lower level of the ages that we're talking about, and putting them in front of a screen and having the person's voice sound like one thing and having what they're happening on their face giving another message. An older child in that bracket, say if we go 3 to 8, what the older child is able to do is look at that and justify the fact that there is a difference, because they're already learning that we don't always say what we mean. What a young child does is they physically look away from the screen because they can't do it. They can't take those two. They know they're conflicting, but they're not yet at that stage of being able to, politicize or socialize it away. So they actually look away. And it's a really interesting process to watch when you start to talk to them about why they do that. So also have ways to engage. So they don't always have to be about talking about emotions and feelings. Bedtime stories is a wonderful way to talk through, emotions, feelings, get them right into that kind of story and how other people are feeling in the story. And things like art is brilliant. So painting with them, making things with them. They'll often talk about ways that they feel, or you can paint things and talk about how those stick figures might feel and what they're doing and why. And I had family meetings I had 2 boys and a German scientist husband who wasn't always really good at engaging with feelings with the boys, and adored them. So we had family meetings which were structured. So the boys learnt very early that they would have a point to talk about, and they had to be able to come along with the point on an agenda and why they wanted to talk about that. And it really kept the high pitch emotions down and got them to be able to talk out. All of us got us to be able to talk out what a point was, how we felt about it, what we might do about it. And they're both pretty good actually at dealing with working through emotional situations and sharing that too, and listening to the other person. So we had that right from when they were 5. They could put something on the agenda and they came to the family meeting, and they were also allowed to call a family meeting from 6 if they wanted to, if they thought there was something that needed to be discussed. And I must say, the person that it was best for was actually my husband. Because he had to stick to their agenda as well. He couldn't overrule them. He had to talk it through. And it was a really interesting process. And the other thing that I've noticed personally is cooking. That was always a really good time as well to talk through it. Very often we would get emotional discussions, and my boys now, my adults, are good cooks, but it was really interesting that was one of those things that they were doing. The other thing is knowing there's a lovely way of putting it. Vigliotti, she's a young PhD, and she talks about if you had a chart on your wall, you've got a chart about how high your child is, but where would you put the height of the socio-emotional growth? And it's a really interesting way of thinking about it. What are they like in being empathic and in being kind and in understanding other people and in thinking about that? Those sorts of things are things that it's a shame we don't teach. Now, how are we going for time? And the last thing I would say on the modelling and mirroring is to also have some consequences, so giving feedback. So if you see them doing something with a friend that is really not good sharing or means that they don't understand reciprocity at all, you talk about it with them at the time. You can't leave it, because one thing is the short-term memory is not as good. You've got to talk about it there, which is the best thing of this course, is that you're with them. But as they get older, you can talk about it later when you leave, rather than embarrassing them. But it is important to bring it up and discuss it, not in a blaming way, but in a how would you feel like if you did that, or if I did that to you, way, to try and just make them think about it the other way, rather than say that was really bad. If it was really bad, then you also have to have a discussion. But what you're trying to do is get them to realize that if they were in that situation, then they potentially wouldn't like, how they acted. Okay. So a couple of minutes on the is it me or not. One of the interesting things to think about with screens is that different parts of the brain light up when you look at someone over a screen. And there are various particular areas that also changes if you know the person. So if you have regular face-to-face interaction, then you get more neural activity when you look over a screen, but it's still different. And part of that is because of what we've talked about. You don't get the chemical exchange, you don't get the neural synchronization of being in the same space, you don't get some of that eye activity because we don't have the same eye-to-eye connectivity over a screen. So you still have quite a lot of changes, quite a lot of differences over a screen. So if you need to talk to your child about something which needs empathy, or for which you need to empathically engage as well, always try and do it face to face. One of the problems we've got is kids learn to text difficult things. They avoid, that direct interaction. And the more you do that, the less skill you gain in that area, and we'll talk about that. So one of the things is we don't know just how often we have to interact over the screen. I talked about the fact that they look away. But one of the things that's involved then in screens is, do you really care as much? Are you as empathic over a screen as you are a face-to-face? There's a lot of discussion about, VR being the empathy machine. The fact is we actually don't know. We can't look at the parts of the brain that are engaged, all of them that are engaged with empathy when people are in VR, because at the moment we can't do that accurately. And there is quite a lot that is different. The level of cognitive fatigue and those kind of things, and excitation over VR can also disrupt various empathic pathways. So one of the things that happens with technology is, because it's so fast and because the activities and information is coming so quickly, that also means that often children's decisions, and actually adults, as you've said as well, Billy, often it's the same, but children's decisions are also quite rapid fire. So they learn to pick up information and automatically try and make decisions quickly, because it sets up that speed, that high speed reactivity of being excited and going fast. And what that does is it gets in the way, it speeds them up so fast that capacity to stop and reflect, format ideas and emotions and think of consequences is really inhibited quite often about, when they're trying to make an empathic decision with this technological speed. It also changes, we've just talked about various cognitive activities. So some people talk about it as hiding behind the digital wall, the digital veil. And what that means is there are also different consequences. So if you're not empathic and you say something which could be seen as cold or not very nice, you don't get that direct interaction of then having to share the person's discomfort or even pain, because you don't see it, you don't pick it up. So that is also not closing that loop, not teaching how it feels, and not increasing your other centeredness. It doesn't happen either as well. It can be quite positive if people are shy, or they're awkward, or they're not very good at their silences. Even if they want to end a friendship that they don't like, of course it's easier over technology. The negative aspect of that is that, as we've said, they don't gain the skills. And what you get is that I think what Twanky calls the Goldilocks effect. So that's the thing where it's not too much, not too little, just right. So what you see very often is already in children of sort of 7 and 8, they're using and crafting and managing and controlling so much what goes out, the texts, what the photos look like, because they're not too far away from the person over text or over screens, and they're not too close. They just keep them far enough away that they can make sure that whatever they put out is controlled and sculpted. And they also don't have to react immediately like you do in a conversation. And the pity is that means that you don't learn how to have that dialogue, how to bounce back. And when I talk to kids sometimes about why do you text instead of talk to someone right next to you, their answer is quite often, but what if they say something I don't know the answer to? And the older the child gets, the more that's the case. But what you notice is if you've got children with high levels of interaction that are social, and that includes being in schools that don't allow technology, it includes being in sports, being in large families, they're much more robust in a conversation. So really try and let your child bring your child constantly into those conversations so that they really learn how to be robust around conversations. Technology can be really good for thought, for creativity, for greater knowledge, for the feeling that you can actually get information and you can send information and you can have ideas. And if you use it that way, there's a really lovely set of studies around if all the difference in the world. If I get a group of children together and I give them a socially positive, caring question, and then I say, use technology to help you to look at that and to investigate, to get good information, then it's terrific because you've got the best of both worlds. You've got the kids together and they're also using the tech for a positive reason, and they are very good then. That partnership, which is, I guess, what I'm always about, is excellent. So that's quite a different use of technology, and that really does assist in their empathic engagement. That's like best of both worlds. If you've just got public commitment in terms of someone will post something about how terrible a certain thing has just happened, and everyone, you get 30,000 people going back and you're one of them going, that's terrible, I'll give $5 or I'll sign a petition. The problem with that is very often it makes people feel like they have an empathic engagement with something, but what actually happens is various parts of their brain don't turn on when they do that. But the part about social judgment, those kind of things do turn on. So we can often, because it's so public, the driver of the behaviour is different.
That's right.
Okay, there's something called the dragonfly effect, and that looks at, and you can have a look at that, looks at the sharp decline in empathy over the 10 years from 79 to 2009 already, and there's another dragonfly effect leap now, and they are looking at that in the sort of iGen, the group that's on screens more, and there's, when they have gone into why, they've looked at the things around, there's a lot more shocking images, which automatically is people look at them because they're curious, but it removes the kind of the really difficult things of having to deal directly with something like that because they are at arm's length. And so, yes, so we've got the Goldilocks effect. And they also bring in the echo chambers, that you tend to talk to the people that believe what you do, the rabbit holes, which means that you don't get information that's different to yours. And the last thing is, if you get really difficult images that you're too young to deal with, then what happens is you get a shutdown of compassion because you get overloaded. So we can have another discussion another time about what kind of media changes the way that you absorb and retain and build information in the brain. And it's quite interesting. A story over a screen is filed and taken in, absorbed and connected and remembered differently than a story over paper and a story over the radio. It's a really, and even over paper and over the screen, if it's written on a screen, it's absorbed differently than if it's written on paper. And it's because of things like the way that the brain reads text on a screen. It's I guess it's another whole discussion we can have. But it does change the way that you absorb and take in the data, the information. It's really interesting. I did promise exercise for a sec, and then do you want me to stop after the exercise?
Yes.
So we talked last month about exercise improves executive function. It increases the neurogenesis because it gives you that BDNF in your brain, and it also improves the survival of the synapses, so your brain is more resilient, and it reduces stress because of all of the chemicals that come into it. So so they've all come onto the screen at once. So a couple of things around technology and the physical health and to do with sort of emotional health. So there's quite a few studies now around taking things like 8-year-olds. If you spend 7 hours, for example, on the screen, then the type of physical emotional links start to look at things like cognitive stress, hormone levels, the irritability and willpower changes the amount of time they'll go and physically exercise. It changes how they work in team sports. So obesity rates tend to go up in places as well where kids aren't out and running around. You can use technology to do things like to move, to dance to tech, to look at eating. But a really good way to do it, I think, is to teach them to manage the tech and turn it off. So there's discussions in both of that. We've talked last month about coordination not being as developed. That's certainly true of the young children in things like the physics engine, but it maintains the same arc. So what you get is when you're not physically using your body or a muscle, you don't build up the cognitive, skill. You don't build up that bundle of knowledge around being able to develop the kinds of physical skills. And what you get, there's some really nice studies around the lower level of the group that we're talking about, the age, the physical activity and human touch, 3 to 4 hours a day. And he's talking about not just running around, but also it changes physical capability because the physical activity does lots of things to do with growing your brain. But the level and anxiety and agitation is also lower, partly because of all of those really nice chemicals you get, but also because of touch, the huge increase you get in those chemicals when you are interacting directly with humans. And touch can be things like sports, where you're rolling around with each other as well. It can be all sorts of different types of touch. And one of the things that they've noticed is childhood depression changes as well. And I think we talked last. Oh, okay. So these are the emotional intelligence 5 factors of self-awareness, self-regulation, social skills, empathy, and motivation. And what I've done is I have a list underneath, which I think we might. Do we want to talk now, and I can give you these afterwards?
I think we can send it across to the people because I said if you're okay with sharing the deck, then I can share that with the audience.
Yes. So what I've done is I've taken each one of those and said what does how does technology influence each of those?
Okay.
And I've done that, and I think there's a couple of others. Yeah, there's something called a ruler program, which takes emotional intelligence. It's a school program, and for people that are dealing with schools and parents who might be able to bring that in, and they've got a really interesting, lovely way of looking at that too. And there's a lot of studies around what it changes. And I think, I'm not sure I think we talked last time about the story of the princess in the tower, the empathy of the story in the book versus the gaming. So that's another thing to kind of think about.
Right. Okay.
I think that's enough. Yeah.
So do you think we should just do a quick Q&A? I think because we are a little out of time. I would love to give the people the opportunity, since we have you over here, to ask you some questions and have them answered before they head off.
Dr. Fiona, I have a simple question.
Just one sec, Vikas. Give me just one second. Dr. Kerr, can you just give the screen control share back to me, because I'm not able to see the entire screen. I've seen your slides, but I cannot seem to have the navigation controls yet. Okay, one sec. Let's see. Where is this? Why can I not see that?
What do you want to see?
I just can't see the Zoom screen at all. Anyway, so Vikas, go ahead. I'll try to figure this out in the meantime.
Just try to put your browser on the screen, and you should see the from popping up from the bottom, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so listen, a number of things that we've covered in that conversation over there. A lot of it has got to do with interaction, being present with the kids, modeling, and you shared some really wonderful ideas around having your family meeting and everybody has an agenda and they come and talk and they get used to putting their point across in an adult way and getting feedback and the other interesting thing which you spoke about was about the height of the socio-emotional growth. We could speak about that offline. It's very interesting because that's the internal texture we just don't get an insight about. Even when you get
No.
reports of kids, yes, they did this, they did that, but you don't get what is the inner world, what's really happening inside the child. I think that's so critical to creating beautiful human beings. And a number of things that you mentioned around how about the dragonfly effect, all of these different things, it just makes me think like 10, 15 years out, or even right now, what is that impact? What is that? How does that impact the leadership capability of human beings going forward, correct? If so much is being internally referenced to your own self, to your own convenience, to how you look, how you position, all of that stuff, what is that really going to impact through genuine, empathic, visionary leadership in the world going forward as well?
Yeah, and we do definitely have information, certainly for the children older. And because I am aware that you have a question, that even older, that the level of emotional engagement has definitely dropped in a lot of areas, and there's certainly high levels of emotion, but they're different kinds of emotion. So it's very much more anxiety around how am I seen, and how do people judge me, and that becomes how do I judge myself? Because if you're looking to sort of down all the time, one of the things you're not doing is kind of looking up and out and looking in. And so I guess I talk about that in looking up, that capacity to be able to self-reflect is critical to liking yourself. It's critical to getting comfortable with the bumps and lumps of who we are, that we are us, and we're legitimate and likable, no matter what. And if your family can give you that feeling as well, that we all have our foibles and they're lovably what makes us what we are. It's that Chinese pot story. I don't know. Does everyone, just before I ask you, because I think it's a really important question, thing to share, because I had it on the back of my toilet door for the boys. And it's a little story about a woman a Japanese woman who has 2 water pots. And every day she goes to pick up water from the well, and she goes home, and one pot has a crack in it and the other one's perfect. And the one with the crack is always really guilty that it's flawed. And one day it talks to the lady and says, I'm so sorry that you take me up and down all the time and I have a crack, and so you work harder and I leak, and I let you down. And what's really lovely is the woman said, but don't you understand? Look at the path. On your side, when I bring you back, are flowers all my way home. And so it's a really gorgeous way. She said, if you didn't have that crack, I wouldn't have the beauty in my life I have. And so it's, saying that we've all got cracks and we don't know how much that gives to other people. So love your own cracks and other people love them too. And I really made sure very early that I had that on the door for the boys, and I would talk about it. And we even had that as a synonym sometimes for some of their really wacky friends or some of our wacky family. And we'd say, okay, so what happens with them? Do we get flowers from them? What do we get? And it really changed their attitude towards perfection and what counts.
Beautiful.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yes.
With questions? Go ahead.
Yes, because.
Yeah. So my question was, First of all, I want to express my gratitude and thanks because the topic you discussed today is the one which I was struggling the most. My battery is down, but if it kills, then know that battery is gone. But the question is, the simple question I have in my mind is, how much empathy or compassion when the child is born has got that quality in it, in built, and how much is the training and the environment? What's the proportion?
Right. It's a great question. And it seems more like almost the physical development of some of the capability to understand it, yourself and other things in the world. So a lot of the theory talks about, you know, the capacity to understand where you are in the system. So for example, a tiny little baby doesn't understand sometimes that if they bite you, they hurt you. But very early on, you can start to show them that happens. And the first time that they learn that, they're usually quite surprised because they haven't put that together. But that kind of physical capability to understand impact on something else is something that, because they're not in the mental capability of knowing that when they're born, at the same time, what they are really good at right from day one is feeling that empathic connection. So they don't always understand consequence, but they do start right from the beginning. They need that connection, and usually it's with it's normally with the mother from day one because they've heard them in utero, but really quickly it becomes the carer that they get used to, and that's through voice. We talked last month about the amazing thing that the human voice does more than anything else at the beginning, actually. Because of, I think it's beta gamma theta, is very much involved in empathic connection and in endorphins and in lots of things to do with connecting. So all of those things are immediately giving information to that child. So if you don't talk to your child, don't look at your child and don't touch your child, they're in this prison of no information and no connection. But if you do, then showing them gently, but showing them that there are, they're interacting with other things in the world. It just helps them right from the beginning to be able to understand. And if you're, you know, as they touch you, if you're touching them back, a lot of reflection, loads of really good parenting is around that beautiful just dance of, you know, the reflection of the touch, the reflection of the. It's why we're very animated when we look at children and talk to them, and they just get lots and lots of that chemical interaction that reinforces
And I
connectivity.
suppose that should be fine for any age group as they're growing up. That's required.
Oh yes, absolutely it is. I mean, yeah, and cuddly kids, always cuddly kids, and even mine are sort of 28 and 32 now, and one of them went through the dip of not wanting to know, not cool to be anywhere near you, but they come.
I think the essence for me is that what you taught me, if I can apply it in an application where I have got a use case in house itself. So I have got two children. One of them naturally is very empathetic towards others, you know, and the situations, and his responses are amazing because, as you know, that, you know, when they respond in that way, then everybody is touched around them. And the other one is more like me. So somehow empathy has been my blind spot for a very long time. I don't know why, but it's like when I realize it, right? When I realize it, then I act correctly. But I've not been realizing it, you know.
But listen, Vikas, I'll stop you right there. So I know Vikas for more than a decade. That's not true about you. The way you interact, you may not be aware. That does not mean it is not there present for you. But just the way you interact, the way you are, I just look at what we do every Sunday in the evening, taking that time out, and the classes that we do, and how you host people at home. I think you have loads of it. You just don't realize it. You've not paid enough attention to realizing it. But I just don't think that is it's a blind spot. You don't know it, but you have enough and more and enough of it.
I wonder if his battery has gone flat just when you were giving them that lovely information.
Oh, yeah, it's gone. He's not here. Okay, anyway, it'll be on the
Again,
recording. I just wanted
it
to
has brought up an interesting thing though. So of my two boys, the first one was highly other-centered and very empathic, very gentle, still is. And the second one we called the Prince because it was all about him, you know, and you had to kind of bang him over the head to make him realize that there was someone else in the world.
Yeah.
And he's ended up a psychologist, which is really funny. But what I had to do with the first one was to actually teach him that he could be, he could actually not give in all the time to the young one, but he could create boundaries. And what I had to do with the second one was just keep saying to him as he got older, you know, this is what happens when that's how you react. This is how I feel, or this is how they're feeling, and constantly remind him, because he was much less other-centered, to remind him. I call them a lighthouse, and I use that with adults too. I've just used it with a very senior person I'm working with. That when you're in the beam, you're everything. They're very good. They can be quite charming. They can pick up everything. But then as soon as the beam sweeps away, you're just not there. And it's not until the beam sweeps back around again, suddenly you're back in their beam. And I said to him, you're a lighthouse. And it's not that you mean it, but when you swing away, you're just totally unaware of that person. And you're not very good at sweeping back and picking it up. And at 25, he finally said, publicly, I had just done a talk and he was with his peers, and finally he said, well, Mum said that I would be a horrible person till 25 and hopefully she'll have, you know, got me into shape by then, and hopefully I've got there. Yeah, so it was very interesting. It was a very long one. Yeah, pretty lovely underneath, but just not good at picking up, you know, picking the feelings up if he's not tuned in.
Yeah. So Vikas is joining us back. So let me complete that. Vikas.
Hey.
Okay, Vikas.
Yes, I'm back. Sorry.
I don't know. You did not hear what I said. You know, you made a statement that one of your blind spots is not being very empathic, correct? Something like that.
Yeah.
What I just reflected back to the group, I do not know how much of that you got. I let them know that I know you for more than a decade, and I know what you are saying is not true at all. The way you host people, the way you and I interact, the way you generally are towards people in your behavior, in your hospitality, does not say anything about what you believe to be true about yourself, that you're not empathic enough. I think you have it. You're very sensitive. You're very, very, you know, your interactions have got concern and understanding for the other person. That's, I think, natural to you. So it's not really, you know, you may not know it, but that's my.
No. So thanks for the kind words. But I think as a child, when I was growing, you know, like just to give a little bit more of light on there, you know. So, you know, I had this tendency, you know, when you win and you think yourself very clever, you know, you're picking those things. At somewhere you lose that reflection, and you know, all of a sudden that pride pops up, and you don't realize even that you're getting arrogant. And I think, you know, when I was like schooling, uni, you know, you are just like how to say, you're very competitive.
Yes.
And at times you're not realizing. And even in my early career days, I think I used to feel, you know, that why people are not understanding, you know, and you're telling them, you know, what to do, what not to do, and that sort of thing. And it came quite late to me that, you know, I realized that how to love differences of each other, cracks of each other, you know, what just
Yes.
the story. And it took very long time, and I had to learn it in a very painful way. You know, when you hurt other people more, when you press their foot quite often and then react, they give you this shock reaction. That's how I learned. And it was not the best way to learn it, but that's how life taught that. But and I was completely, what to say, you know, flabbergasted, not no clue what's happening, you know, because naturally I'm not like that internally, but then I'm not understanding where I'm putting my foot on people, you know, why they're responding like that. And then I realized, you know, that not able to read the signs, some of it which you were talking about, and you know,
Well, what we
not
talked
sometimes.
about when you were offline was that and I won't go through all of it again, but what I said was I had one of each with the boys. I had one who was very other-centered, and I actually had to give him permission not to be so kind, almost, because otherwise he'd just, you know, everyone. And he's still a peacemaker at 32. He still will try and please everyone. And the other one walked around like a little prince and was constantly in need, and it probably still is slightly, of being reminded that that he needs to listen to or stop and think about other people and take them into consideration. And one of the things that I did, even at sort of already at sort of 7 or 8, was to talk about the fact that he was going to miss everyone has, you know, has a bit of gold in them. Everyone has something that you totally underestimate about something. And if you do walk around too full of your own importance or too clever, and you might well be very clever, you will miss that. And that's not clever. So those sort of conversations were the sorts of conversations we had.
Just want to ask, you know, Parul and Ranjit if they have any questions.
Yeah,
I do. Sorry.
Okay, go ahead, Ranjit.
Go ahead, Parul.
Okay. So thank you so much, Dr. Kerr. The question that I wanted to ask was that I have a teenager, and I've seen this pattern with him over the years, say over the last 3-4 years now, that whenever we try and have a conversation about, I'll just put on my video so that it's just clear. One second. So whenever I try and have a conversation with him or try and explain something to him, whether it is academics or whether it's a general experience that I may have had, and, you know, eventually trying to share something from that, I'm always faced with a reaction where it comes that I know it, you know, so yeah, so I know it, you know, I've got it all figured. While I appreciate the fact that he may have figured a few of the things himself, he's 13. He's obviously not figured it all. I know I haven't. How do I make him open to experiences from which he may learn? And he should be open to not just his own experiences, but also to, you know, somebody else sharing their experiences with him.
Yeah. And again, it was easier for me with one of them, but not with the other one. So what we did was, if I really had to talk to him about something that he thought he knew and he wasn't absorbing at all, then we actually, we went out for coffee. We went to a completely different place. We didn't do it at home. We did it in a neutral environment. The only other time was driving. I never ever had the radio on in the car, and he wasn't allowed to have headphones on in the car either. And he could sit there in silence. It didn't matter, but sooner or later they talk. And sometimes it was just me talking about how I felt about something, with him going, yeah, I know. And I would just chat, but they listen. They're listening to you. As long as they're not got the headphones in, they are definitely absorbing it. And if it was really important, and he got that little bit older, but probably from 13 on, we would actually catch up for a cup of coffee. And then he knew that there was something, not that he was going to get, I didn't do it just because I wanted to tell him off or he was in trouble. It was something to discuss. And what became really interesting was quite early on, I think only from about 8, we got up on Sunday mornings before the other two, and we would have a hot chocolate and sit in another place in our dressing gowns and have a conversation that we didn't have at any other time. So that taught me with him that was the thing to do, was to take him out and do a one-on-one engaging conversation, and talk about, as you said, my environment, my experiences as well, and some, you know, either funny anecdotes or some things I did really dumbly, and share that. And so he became quite good at that. So that was completely separate from the other normal rough and tumble in discussion and parenting.
And how would I, this is with me now, how would I want him to be engaged in a similar fashion with his father as well, with my husband as well, which I feel is greatly lacking?
Yes, and it depends on what your husband's like. whether he's quiet, whether he's robust, whether he listens well, whether he is a person who thinks he knows things as well. It's very dependent on his personality and his relationship already with your son. So, you know, do they have a capacity where he listens well and they engage and chat about things? Yeah, so that's the sort of thing. I mean, that's actually one of the reasons why from early on we had our family meetings, because their dad was not good at it.
Would be a great forum. Powerful.
Yeah,
It
yeah, his dad really wasn't good at engaging. Yeah. And in fact, his dad at first said, look, you know, I don't really want to do this. And we said, well, no, you haven't got a choice. This is the thing that we need to do together. And what I appealed to Holger about was the kids learning how to you know, talk through something, think through something, deal with something and articulate. But it was as much their dad easily, because I come out of an industrial relations background, all men, you know, mining, power stations, industrial negotiation, and I just knew that really early on they needed to learn how to listen and how to empathize and how to be able to pick up information and make reflective decisions for themselves as well as for other people. Yeah, and I must say, at one time, I had gone back full time, and he's now my ex, but we're fine, we're friends, and brilliant man, kind but not tolerant, and I went back to work full time on a really interesting project. He wanted to go part time and to look after the kids and do the house up, because he said, "Oh, you just don't do it very well. I can do all of that." Yeah, great, fine. And the kids fired him. They called a family meeting and they fired him. And they went through why, you know, and it was really cool and calm, and he couldn't do anything about it, because they put on the table, this is why, and you're angry and we don't think you're fair about this, and you're not doing that, and he had to sit and listen to it, and he had to go through, and it was probably the biggest thing that changed his way of interacting with me more than anything else ever. He was devastated. He fired him. He was really, what? But it worked. It worked really well.
Yeah. I wonder if Dr. Kerr, what we can do offline with Chelsea's help is to just create a little small infographic on these family meetings. This,
Sure.
and this, and then I can share with the others as well.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I know
we can do that.
you had a question as well. Is that right?
Yeah. So thanks, Dr. Fiona, for such a detailed insight. Just maybe a little specific about the storytelling thing which you have, you know, mentioned. So I just wanted to know, like, you know, kids like to watch movies and, you know, maybe get a lot of stories around it. But I have read somewhere that, you know, you should encourage kids to read, you know, so that, you know, imagine things. But it's a little hard time, you know, to make them read, you know, the stories, because they, you know, so what do you think that, you know, is a good way of doing a storytelling, or both ways of watching or reading is the same, you know, which should be encouraged? So maybe a little, you know, help, which is the better way, or both are similar, or which should be encouraged?
Both. They are different. How old are your children?
My child is 13 and my daughter is just 4.
Okay. They are different, and so you would also, I guess, deal with the two differently, because that's a big difference in age. But when you so with the 13-year-old, very much we watched things together. We would choose what to watch and we would discuss it, and we still do with both of them. If we watch something together, we still quite discuss it. We probably drive other people nuts sometimes, because it's something to be absorbed in, but also comment on. And so we watch that. But with the children, the interesting thing is, because I read every night, all the time, and we read the books and did the voices and all that, it was a very immersive, really enjoyable experience. And they read to me, and then I read to them every night. And I found that even the 13-year-old, when the young one was 9, still came into the reading. He would still sit there. He'd kind of go and lie on the other bed, but he'd still be part of it. And I think that I always thought that was really interesting. And sometimes it was because I think we would, we did Harry Potter, of course, and he still, even though he read them himself, he still actually liked being in the room where they were read. And when they were being experienced, and it seemed to be just one of those things that we did at night, because we had always done a story and then a song. I had a Scottish background, singing, and we had a song where every day I made up, there was the sun's gone to bed, it was called, and then every chorus was what they did during the day. And so that was kind of about their life, and so they liked it. And I don't think I stopped doing that until they were teenagers. They were real soft, but it was just one of those connectivity things, which was the kind of saying goodnight to the day. But I was really interested that the 13-year-old would still come in his big long surf-legged way and just be there when the young one was getting read to. And so they do different things, because when you are interacting and reading a story to a child, especially at night, it's a really good way of them coming down out of all sorts of stimulation. You turn on all sorts of different parts in their brain, and it's not only to do with, certainly it's to do with empathy and creativity and imagination, but because you're reading it with your voice is creating a lot of endorphins in their brains, enkephalins, which is immune activity as well. So you're calming down their affect, which is their amygdala activation. You're doing a number of things in their brain, which is giving them chemicals which are relaxing them, and which are putting them into that frame of mind where they are very connected. And if you're lying in the same bed as them and touching, which usually we are in some way, they're leaning on you or doing that, then you've got C fiber attenuation of your skin, and there's a whole other bunch of chemicals that they're eliciting. It's one of the reasons why they fall asleep well when you're reading to them. And that capacity for imagination. Also, I still read a novel at night to go to sleep, because it stops the busy brain. It takes you out of that and puts you in something else, which is all yours, and it takes all of the rest away. And that's what that does for them as well as a child. It puts them in literally a different headspace. We use that term, and we're absolutely right. So you've got all of that emotional connection and bonding and love and togetherness, and you've also got lots of chemical activation around all of the really pleasurable chemicals that let them relax. And you've got that beautiful creativity where they're imagining everything, which is very different than watching it on a screen, which is highly cognitively fatiguing as well as exciting. So that sets their brain off rather than sort of soothing it.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting question, actually, Ranjit. I had the same question. I have another question. This was around the chemicals that we give off, right? Right at the beginning of the presentation, you were talking about the chemicals that we give off when we are interacting with people.
Yeah.
And I'm connecting it to what I was thinking about at the time was that, can we manage those chemicals that we give off by changing the way we think and our thought process? Because I'm equating chemicals to the vibes. You know what you can feel the vibe. Sometimes they say you can cut the tension with a knife in the room.
Yeah.
And that perhaps is going to do with thinking and the chemicals and what's going out. So does that make sense? If we are in that and we know that we will be generating some kind of, there will be some exposure or something going out of us into the world, especially we are in the presence of kids, then it's just a matter of us to be able to think differently or find a way to clear our day. Like, let's assume the parent is coming back from the office in the evening. It's almost like having a process of just calibrating when you get back into the home. So that's out of the way, and then you can be fully present, and your vibe is different, and the chemicals that you're going to give off to your child, even if you don't say anything to them, it'll be much more loving and much more welcoming, and they would like to be in that space.
It is, and you're right, there's two levels there. One is the level of, even if you don't say even if you're not directly interacting with them, if you are relaxing because you're home, then, you know, down goes all of those volatiles to do with adrenaline and stress and cortisol and all that kind of thing. And you start giving off very different chemicals. It's why your dog can read them, and you know, we can read them with each other. If you step into an environment where people are on edge, we just stop, and the hairs go up on the back of your neck and you feel it, and it shuts down that kind of lovely, hey, hi everyone. But if you go in and you've got that beautiful emotional contagion of everyone's having fun and connecting, then you immediately just open up and you start to socialize more, and you're, you know, it's very different because we're picking up those chemicals as well as the actual, you know, so we've got an electrochemical, we've got two things happening. So the first thing is you stop giving off the negatives. But if you actually then ramp it up and connect with your child, which is what you know, also hopefully you should be doing because you actually want to see them, then you've got that whole rush of actual paying attention, turning on all of that lovely, you know, oxytocin and all those beautiful endorphins, and they get this big, and then you pick them up, and again you've got all of that C fiber attenuation, electrochemical activity, and they get this big rush of really positive chemicals.
So here's
So you can't fake it.
Okay, this is maybe related or not related, but I think as a parent, okay, now there is what so I think there is a level of acceptance that you want from a child as a parent as well, right? You feel good about it and stuff. My question is more around, as a parent, you're there, you come into the room, and the child says something to you, no matter what age, it triggers the hell out of you. Go away. I don't want to see your face. So what practice can you suggest to a parent? This is going to happen. I mean, kids in a way that jobs will take you for granted, and so it's fine. They're there for that in some ways. So what mental practice do you recommend for a parent who is in a situation where they are getting triggered by the child and being able to manage it in a different way, which is productive rather than slapping, hitting, shouting, all that stuff going on?
Yeah, I guess there's a bunch of things there. You know, how often does it happen? Has it happened because it's a particular thing? So if it's a constant occurrence, that's different than if your child says it, and if it was an occasional thing, which it was for my second one, then I had a tendency more to either, depending on how they said it, either sit and say, what's up? It was like, you know, clearly there's something about you. Or if it was less emotionally charged, and I wanted to, and sometimes I would just do the, you know, oh come on, I want to cuddle, and I need the chemicals, and then they'd kind of go, oh whatever, and give me a hug, and again, but that does actually still change that whole electrochemical interaction. If it's consistent, then you've really got to think about, you know, the why, because we get what we reward. So what's rewarding them doing that regularly, and is it that they've got, and usually it's bad habits, and often it's bad habits on both sides. One thing that I did not allow in my kids was, if I connected, or it's whenever we saw each other, neither one was allowed to not look at the other person. You know, you could not just stay looking at your screen. You couldn't not look up. You couldn't not acknowledge and stop and enter that person into your brain, and say hello. That wasn't negotiable.
Yeah. So it sounds like you had some very clear non-negotiables in your house.
We had some really clear
non-negotiables. The message
non-negotiables.
from there is very clear for parents, is that you know, it's not to be soft for the kids all the time and how are you, and you've got to have some very clear boundaries. They are living it's our responsibility to you know, to mold them in a certain way and have the right structure. And a part of that is this whole thing that you are living, you're interacting with other human beings, and these are acceptable. This is non-negotiable no matter what happens. When people come back, we hug, we kiss, we ask them how the day was.
That's right.
We have dinner together every week. We have family meeting. You are equally empowered to call one and, you know, put stuff on the agenda. So it just sounds like that's the way you were At least that's the
Yeah,
way.
there were very definite things. Every now and then, I would, if I entered into the other person's space, and again, we're talking about a bit older now than our normal 3 to 8. But if we're drifting into the teenager, then I could go into his space, and he might be involved in a game because he had a 1 hour window a day that he could do that. And again, that was really, really strict. And if it was that, then, and he was in the middle of something he clearly couldn't stop, then I would say, okay. But as soon as that's finished, I want a hug. You need to make that up to me, but with a hug. And that probably only happened on one hand because it wasn't worth it to him. And the other rest, and not, I guess another thing I'm thinking of is with my later partner, one of his children was slightly Asperger's and would come. It was only a weekend child for us, and had never had to acknowledge, say hello, any of that sort of thing when he came into the house. I was used to just being able to walk straight through, and it's, again, it's not negotiable. So I would say, no, stop, hello, and at first he wouldn't, and it was no, turn around. You have to say hello. You're actually not going into that room until that's what you do. This is what we do. This is why. And absolutely drove him nuts. He was only 9 or 8 when we started. That's old enough, absolutely old enough to know. So then we got to the stage where he used to come and he would say, I'd say hello, because he tried to walk past, and then he'd turn to go hello and be really kind of, and I'd say thank you, hello, how are you, and and he'd kind of go off. That's that young man now. We have one of the best relationships. And what used to be interesting was his sister would say, he'll say hello in your house, but he won't do it at home. And that's partly, there's all sorts of things, but it was partly because even if you have 2 parent households, if you've got a child with divorced parents, for example, they know really early on, they know at 3 and 4 actually, the difference in the rules.
That's right.
And so what you've got to always think about is, why have I got the rules, and are they reasonable? Are they improving the interaction with myself and my child? Are they teaching them to be a better human being? Are they teaching me to be a better human being? And if that's what's happening, if it's out of love and if it's for a good reason, then you keep on with them. And as they get older, you can explain more and more about why, but you don't not do it. You still do it. Then they learn that that's the way you interact, and that you give respect. It's about respect and love.
And I think it almost is like, like we treat our profession, we have CPD and we are going to learn a sport, you will learn it. I think it's the same with parenting. It's not really a title, it's a way of being. And it just requires, I suppose, conversations like these with people like yourselves, or even as a community, of having the space and the time as parents to bring out what we're dealing with and get some inputs and feel empowered enough and supported to do what we got to do. Because we improve as parents, they improve as kids. It's just an upward spiral that way, right?
It is, yeah. It's a lovely, rewarding sort of cycle if you take it that way. And we're always learning. They're always learning. We're always learning. But you've got to keep going. You've got to have input. It's hard
We've
work.
got time for maybe one more question, and then we need to start wrapping this up. It's about, it's gone an hour and a half, almost 2 hours. But I suppose the topic is just so great and so rich. Any last question before we wrap up?
Yes, Joanna.
I have a question. Again, I'm not a parent. I'm doing some preventive care here. And my question, some of the things that we discussed today already answered it, but I wanted to make it more specific. And I think this is also about emotional regulation from our part, from parents, educators towards the children. I think it's easy to get a little bit upset and feel left out when we are competing with social media in a way,
Yes.
and screens. I feel this with children and even with adults sometimes, that what I have to offer as a person or as an educator in that moment is not as exciting as what lives in a screen. In a screen, you have the whole world, you have all of your friends, all the games that you like, beautiful animals, everything in a screen, and what I have to offer is limited because I'm just a person, and even the activities that we can do together are relatively limited. They are self-contained in that moment, and the screen and the internet is infinite. So what are your thoughts on this, both on how we can deal with this in the sense of self-esteem, and also make ourselves more maybe not more interesting, but what do we have that is better as parents, educators, and people in the life of children, that is in this moment better, of course, in some cases
Yeah.
not, than technology.
Wow, I would really see it as the opposite. And I guess that, that TEDx on looking to my eyes was kind of one of the ways of trying to talk about that. Because what they've got in the screen is, they've got excitement, they've got the stickiness, they've got the dopamine, they've got the peripheral vision kind of going off. So they actually got lots of cognitive excitation, but that's quite empty in a lot of ways. It's quick and it's distracting, and it's yes, it is cognitively exciting, but what you offer is this deep well of sort of electrochemical activity that connects them to feeling that they belong, and to having their brain and their body work better, and to being able to think and create and reason and empathize and feel joy, a type of joy they're never going to feel on any form of media, and a type of acceptance and connection that they're never going to feel on any media. So I think the way to think about it is, you're this walking capability to keep them emotionally and physically well, and to top them up, and to make sure that they are connected and respected and sort of loved and liked by the social system, the society and family that they live in. It's absolutely critical for their physical and emotional well-being. And it's fine to be distracted by something bright and shiny, but that's all that screen is. Now, to say that, I'm doing technology, which I adore, a great injustice in some ways, in that if you work with them on the screen, I work on all sorts of transformative, technology. It's brilliant, but it's through and because and with other people who are wanting to transform human lives with that technology. So if you go exploring with the child using tech, that teaches them how to cleverly manage it and look for it, look with it, and use it as a tool and an enabler, and those sorts of things. So notwithstanding that whole conversation, that's a completely different conversation. What you're always competing against, especially when they're young, that's not true. There's devastating statistics on what the tech does to couples, no matter what they're doing. In fact, there's amazing tech sort of stats on all sorts of activities that they now take technology in with. But what you've got with the child is just knowing that, yes, you're competing against something which has been absolutely built by, on the other side of that screen are hundreds and thousands of people trying to make sure that child as a product stays stuck to that screen.
That's right.
That's what they're there to do, and that's what they've designed this thing to do. And so absolutely, that means that that's very exciting and very sticky. And so that's where parenting and rules actually come in. So that's where we always had the rule that if I needed to talk to my child or my partner, and I do it with friends too, we have etiquette around technology. They were never at tables. If someone actually wants to talk to you, you put them down and you look at the person. And that again, that wasn't negotiable.
It almost sounds like, to me, listening to the various conversations today, is that it's also a matter of maybe when we feel that like I asked you, that feeling rejected and all that, it's almost we have to remind ourselves to take a focus off ourselves and bring it back onto the child, and then ask the question, is this the right time for the kid to be on social media? If it is, use your judgment and that's fine. But if you do realize that, right, okay, I don't think so, depending on what they're doing, what time, people around them, etc., then, it's a simple matter of, okay, time out. And maybe giving them the reason that, look at this, look around you.
Yeah, and the reasons are important. The older they are,
yeah.
Sorry, but the older they are, the better they can, the more science they can absorb. So my poor kids were walking, talking, sort of, they'd say, oh, for God's sake, not again about this chemical. But it didn't matter, they got it. And it was, so I would sometimes get to the stage of if it really was a case of, look, you need to put that down if we have to have this conversation. It was me basically saying, this is my job. I don't care if you like it or not. My job is to instill in you the kind of respect for interaction and other people that you expect and you want. And that's my job, and that's what you'll do. But the other side of it is, when I could, very often it was, think about the positives I'm giving you now compared to that. I'm giving you all this stuff and it's robbing you of them. So we'd also at times make jokes about it. And you have to do both. But again, they do remember it. And over time, it gets in. I can tell you now, I would have thought with my 20-odd-year-old that it didn't work. It certainly did. And it really surprises me now that he's a 28-year-old, just how much he absorbed. And when he now speaks to other people about what it was like growing up with me, it's amazing, because I thought I was just a pain in the ass the whole time, and that's not the story. So keep on knowing that you're doing the right thing. Also, wanting to be respected in the interaction is never ever something that you should not fully feel in your right, that is one of your rights. Because if you don't model that respect to them, then they're not going to understand it either. You have to demand respect back to show them what respect is like, not unreasonableness, which is why every now and then I would say, all right, I can understand 5 minutes, something like that. If they had to clean up, he might be in the middle of something. If he was sort of 7 or 8, then I'd say, all right, you've got 2 to 3 minutes, and then I want to see you out there. But that wasn't all the time, because then it would stretch to 5 to 10. And if he didn't come out in the 2 to 3, whatever he was doing went off. Like I'm one of those people that would just turn off the server.
Right. Wow, fantastic. Great. Listen, I think we just going to wrap up now. It's almost a couple of hours. We do have another one coming up in July. So it's on the 15th of July, and you are all on the mailing list, so you will be kept informed of when these sessions are happening.
Yeah. I guess the way that I would wrap up in that last kind of sentence is just to think about the fact that you are, in modeling, being empathic and being respectful to them, which also means that there are times when you're going to be able to have to pay attention and do things you don't want to. And even as adults, we have to do that. It really does give them the skills and the resilience of being much happier, more capable adults as well as children. So you're actually doing a really good job, as in that you're not doing them any favors if you allow them to be either, not just spoiled brats, but if you allow them not to learn how to think about what the impact of their activity is, and how they very much want to be treated like the same, the other way.
And I think the counterpoint of the balancing point of that is also to ask yourself how much of this liberty you're giving them is for acceptance, for your own acceptance, as compared to it's actually required. So I think there are a couple of things over there. So, thank you so much, Dr. Kerr. Phenomenal talk. I think we could hear you talking for ages. You have all the research, and you're a practitioner as well. So, it's a big difference. You're a practitioner. You interact with people, real world. You do some phenomenal research products all around the world. And just so many takeaways as usual. So, on behalf of everybody over here, just deeply thankful for you taking the time out, preparing. I mean, this is what we're seeing. But I know before this, you have taken the time out to do the preparation, and you probably had to say no to a few things because of doing this. So really deeply appreciate what you're doing for us. And Yeah, we're thinking about, just for the others, we're thinking about maybe creating a parenting mindfulness workshop as well. So you keep
Mm.
an eye out for that, because it's all about helping the parents create that space within themselves, and then they can fund the space for the kids outward from themselves as well. So we have a few things on our mind. Within the next couple of days, you will get an email from me from the Billu Bollywood Worldwide email ID, just requesting your feedback and a few other things. If you have any suggestions, any further requests for topics, etc., please feel free to write to me directly, and we can see what we do about it. So, well, it's a Monday. Have a great rest of your week. Thank you for all for taking out your time out and for doing your work as parents to get a better life for your kids. So, acknowledging all of you for doing that as well.
Thanks. Thank you all.
Okay.
Thanks, Dr.